In a government warehouse outside Washington, there's a stack of film canisters that sat untouched for almost 30 years. No labels, no index card. Nobody knew what was on them, and for a long time, nobody bothered to check. When someone finally threaded one of those reels through a projector, what came up on the screen was in color, it was intimate, and it should not have existed at all. It was home footage from inside Adolf Hitler's private world, shot by the one person closest to him in the final years before everything collapsed. That reel is only one piece of what we're covering today. There's more, and some of it was hidden on purpose, not by accident, by people who watched it once and decided the world wasn't ready to see it. Not in 1945. In one case, not for another 40 years. This is the story of the footage that survived the fall of Nazi Germany, the footage that almost didn't, the footage that was deliberately buried by the very people who filmed it, or by the people who inherited it after the war ended. Some of what you're about to hear was eventually used to convict the men responsible for the worst crimes of the 20th century. Some of it disappeared into archives so completely that historians assumed it was simply gone. And some of it shows the last living images of a man responsible for the deaths of millions, trembling, hollow-eyed, congratulating children for a war that was already lost, filmed in the open, broadcast to the German public, and somehow still hidden from the rest of us for decades in plain sight. Before we get to any of that, you need to understand where all of this footage came from in the first place, because that part surprises people every time I bring it up. The collapse of Nazi Germany was one of the most heavily filmed events of the entire war. Propaganda cameramen kept shooting almost until the literal end, because the machine that had spent over a decade building Hitler's image through film wasn't built to just switch off the moment things stopped going the regime's way. At the same time, Allied forces were rolling into German territory with their own film units, under direct orders from the top to document everything, because senior command already understood that photographs and paperwork alone would not be enough to convince the world, or a future generation, of what had actually happened here. And inside the private homes of the Nazi elite, ordinary home movie cameras were still running, completely divorced from any of that, capturing birthday parties and mountain vacations, while the continent burned a few hundred miles away. 3 very different types of cameras, rolling in the same collapsing country, for 3 completely different reasons. And every single one of them would eventually produce footage that someone, somewhere, decided the public shouldn't see. Let's start with the most personal piece of this story, because it's also the one that took the longest to come to light. Eva Braun, Hitler's longtime companion, was an enthusiastic amateur filmmaker. Between the late 1930s and 1944, she shot home movies almost constantly at the Berghof, Hitler's mountain residence above Berchtesgaden in the Bavarian Alps. 28 reels of 16mm film in total, much of it shot in color at a time when color home movies were still a novelty almost nobody outside the wealthiest circles in the world had any access to. What's actually on those reels is, on the surface, deliberately mundane. Braun and her circle of friends sunbathing on a terrace, dogs running across a lawn, children playing while adults look on and laugh, Hitler himself, out of uniform, feeding a fawn by hand, cracking a joke at something off camera, looking, for lack of a better word, almost ordinary. That ordinariness is exactly what makes this footage so difficult to sit with. It was never shot to prove anything or convince anyone of anything. It's simply what a woman pointed her camera at, without an audience in mind. Which means it captured Hitler the way almost nobody else ever filmed him. Not the fists on the podium, not the stiff-armed salute, not the voice pitched for a stadium of thousands. Off-message, unguarded. Human in a way that the propaganda machine spent over a decade making sure the public never saw. When American forces reached Berchtesgaden near the very end of the war, they found piles of unmarked film canisters sitting in the wreckage of the Nazi leadership's private compound. Nobody at the time understood what they'd actually stumbled onto. The reels were boxed up, shipped back across the Atlantic, and handed over to the National Archives, where they were logged under a plain, almost bureaucratic title, Private Motion Pictures of Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun, and then placed into storage alongside thousands of other boxes of captured wartime material nobody had the staff or the urgency to sort through. And there the film sat, for years, then for decades. 9 of the original 28 reels survive today. For a long stretch of the time in between, they simply sat in a government warehouse, uncatalogued, unexamined, gathering dust next to mountains of military intelligence that officials at the time considered far more urgent. Nobody made a formal decision to bury this footage as part of some grand cover-up. It was almost worse than that, in a way. It was simply forgotten. A piece of film that shows the private, human face of one of history's most destructive men, and for decades. The honest answer to whether anyone in the world was actually watching it was no. Nobody. Not one frame. Here's a question worth sitting with for a second, because I think it says something about how we process history, and I want to know where you land on it. Why do you think this particular footage disappeared into a warehouse instead of being studied immediately the moment it was found? Was it genuinely just bureaucratic neglect? Thousands of reels of captured material and nobody had the time to sort through all of it? Or do you think, on some level, even without a formal order from anyone, people preferred not to look too closely at Hitler as a man who fed fawns by hand and laughed with his friends on a mountainside? It's a lot easier to process someone as a monster in uniform on a podium than as a person who apparently had an ordinary domestic life 5 minutes before signing off on unimaginable horror. Drop your answer in the comments, because I've gone back and forth on this one myself while researching it, and I genuinely don't think there's a clean answer. The second piece of footage in this story wasn't lost by accident at all. It was suppressed on purpose by people who knew exactly what they were sitting on and chose to sit on it anyway. In April of 1945, as Allied forces liberated concentration camps across Germany one after another, senior command understood almost immediately that photographs alone were never going to be enough to make the world, or the German public specifically, accept the full scale of what had happened. So, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force commissioned an official documentary, and the job landed in the hands of Sidney Bernstein, a British film producer who would go on to found one of the country's major television networks. Bernstein assembled a small team of editors and writers and brought in Alfred Hitchcock, yes, that Hitchcock, as a directorial advisor, specifically for his skill at structuring unbearable material into something an audience could actually sit through without simply shutting down. For 5 months, this team worked through hours of raw liberation footage. Material shot by military cameramen who had walked directly into the camps within the first hours and days after they were opened. Cameras rolling while the horror was still fresh, before anything could be cleaned up or staged for the record. The goal was a feature-length film, blunt, unflinching, and structurally impossible to dismiss as propaganda, because every single frame of it was real, unscripted, undeniable. By late September of 1945, they had a rough cut finished and ready, and it was screened for officials at the Ministry of Information in London, the culmination of nearly half a year of grueling work assembling the most damning visual record of the Holocaust that existed anywhere on Earth. And then, almost as soon as it was finished, it was shelved. The reasons had almost nothing to do with the footage itself and everything to do with a political map that had already started shifting underneath everyone's feet. By the autumn of 1945, the alliance that had just defeated Germany together was already fracturing along new lines. Rising tension with the Soviet Union meant that a rebuilt, stable, cooperative West Germany was quickly becoming strategically necessary to the very same governments that, only months earlier, had wanted to shame that same country into a permanent moral reckoning it could never walk back from. A documentary engineered to force German audiences to confront the full, unedited horror of what their government had just done no longer fit the political moment those officials were now navigating. So the film was left unfinished, not destroyed, which in its own way is stranger and colder than destruction would have been. Just quietly set aside, incomplete, and left to gather dust in an archive for almost 70 years. It sat there, unseen by the public, until 2014, when the Imperial War Museum finally completed the restoration and assembled the film the way its original creators had always intended it to be shown. Archivists worked from the surviving rough cut, the original shot lists, and Bernstein's own notes on how the final sequence was supposed to flow, piecing together nearly 70 years later exactly what a team of exhausted editors had assembled in 1945, and then never been allowed to finish releasing. The story of how it disappeared and how it eventually resurfaced became the subject of its own award-winning documentary in its own right, built almost entirely around the strange, uncomfortable fact that the most complete visual record of the camp's liberation had been sitting, finished in every way that mattered, inside a government archive the entire time anyone alive today has been alive to ask about it. And here's the detail that ties this directly back into something much bigger than one shelved film sitting in a vault. Portions of the raw footage this same team gathered, that identical liberation material, were used only weeks later as evidence at the Nuremberg trials, shown directly to judges deciding the fate of the men responsible for ordering the camps into existence. So the very footage one government quietly decided the public wasn't ready to see was, at almost the exact same moment, considered solid enough evidence to help convict war criminals in a court of law, suppressed from ordinary people and simultaneously trusted enough to help send men to the gallows. Sit with that contradiction for a second, because it tells you almost everything about how selectively the truth gets released, even by people who already know in that moment exactly what it proves. There's a third layer to this story that most people have genuinely never heard of, because for decades it disappeared behind a border almost nobody in the West could cross. Nazi Germany kept its own state film archive, the Reichsfilmarchiv, an enormous library of newsreels, propaganda films, and raw, uncut footage documenting the regime from the inside out, including material shot in Berlin during the very final weeks of the war, cameramen still filming the city collapsing around them as Soviet forces closed in street by street, building by building. When Berlin fell in the spring of 1945, this archive, along with an enormous quantity of other captured German film material, was seized by Soviet forces as spoils of war, the same way tanks and artillery and factories were seized. Some of it was studied by Soviet analysts looking for intelligence. A great deal of it was simply filed away in Soviet archives and effectively vanished from Western access for the entire length of the Cold War that followed. For decades, Western historians knew, in theory, that this material still existed somewhere. They had almost no realistic way to see it, catalog it, or even confirm exactly what had survived the seizure. Requests filed through official channels went nowhere, or came back with partial answers, or simply weren't answered at all, because releasing this material meant admitting exactly what had been sitting in storage the entire time. And admitting that meant reopening questions about a defeated enemy's internal footage, at a moment when the political relationship with the country now holding it was already tense enough without adding a decades-old film library to the list of grievances. It wasn't until the political landscape shifted again, years after the Cold War itself had ended, that researchers finally began getting meaningful access to what had been sitting inside those Soviet archives the entire time. Footage of the actual physical collapse of the Nazi state, filmed from inside the crumbling city itself, by cameramen who, in some cases, had no idea their own government was days, sometimes only hours, away from ceasing to exist entirely. Footage of the end of the Third Reich, filmed by the Third Reich's own propaganda units, locked away by the country that had just defeated it, for reasons that had nothing to do with historical preservation and everything to do with a new global rivalry that replaced the old war almost overnight. Think about what that actually means for a second. Somewhere in those seized reels, there is almost certainly footage of German cameramen filming their own government's final days without knowing it, capturing officials still issuing orders for a war that had already been lost weeks earlier, capturing ordinary Berliners going through the motions of daily life directly underneath artillery fire because there was nowhere left to evacuate to. That's a fundamentally different kind of footage than anything shot by the Allies or by Eva Braun's home camera. It's the regime documenting its own ending from the inside, without the benefit of hindsight, without knowing yet how the story would finish. And for half a century, almost nobody outside a small circle of Soviet archivists had any idea it even existed. Now put all three of these threads side by side, because that's really the point of everything we've covered so far. The most intimate footage of Hitler's private life sat forgotten in an American warehouse, simply because nobody in a position of authority made it a priority. The most damning footage of what his regime actually did to human beings sat deliberately shelved inside a British archive, because it no longer served a political agenda that had already quietly shifted underneath it. And footage of the regime's own physical collapse, filmed by its own propagandists, sat locked behind Soviet borders for reasons of pure geopolitical leverage that had nothing to do with the footage itself. Three completely different governments, three completely different reasons for burying what they had, and the same basic outcome every single time. Whoever physically controls the film controls how, and whether, and when the ending of this story gets told to anyone else. Which brings us to the piece of footage that ties every one of these threads together, the literal last moving images of Adolf Hitler alive, and the day that historians consistently point to as the moment the visible collapse of the Third Reich finally got caught, unmistakably, on camera. On the 20th of March, 1945, just over a month before he would take his own life in a bunker beneath that same city, Hitler stepped out into the garden of the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. It was, by every surviving account and by the footage itself, essentially his last public appearance outdoors, and propaganda cameramen were there waiting to capture it. Because even with Soviet artillery already within earshot of the capital, the machine that had spent over a decade filming this man as a symbol of unstoppable strength was still, out of habit, or denial, or simple institutional inertia, doing the only job it knew how to do. What those cameras captured that day was the exact opposite of everything that machine had spent a decade building. Hitler walked slowly down a line of boys from the Hitler Youth, some of them barely into their teens, decorated with iron crosses for defending positions against the advancing Soviet army in the war's final, hopeless weeks. In the surviving footage, his left hand visibly shakes, a tremor he can't hide and doesn't seem able to control. He looks smaller than the image the propaganda machine had spent years constructing around him, hollowed out, moving stiffly, patting one boy's cheek with a gesture that reads less like a supreme commander and more like an elderly relative saying goodbye. The boys themselves stare up at him with a kind of unguarded, worshipful admiration that had been carefully drilled into an entire generation of German children, seemingly untouched by the fact that the war their leader was congratulating them for surviving was, by that point, already unwinnable in every strategic sense that mattered. It is an almost unbearable piece of footage to sit through, precisely because both sides of the frame are telling you something true at exactly the same time. The regime's total visible collapse, and the regime's total success at convincing children to believe in it until the very last weeks of its existence. This particular reel wasn't buried in a warehouse or shelved by a cautious ministry the way the other footage in this story was. It was filmed, processed, and released openly as newsreel material at the time, shown to German audiences in cinemas within the regime's own propaganda channels, hiding in plain sight the entire time. It took the total, unconditional defeat of the country that produced it before this footage could finally be seen for what it actually was. Not a display of strength, the way it was originally packaged and sold to a nervous public. Documentary proof of the exact opposite, sitting in an ordinary cinema newsreel the whole time, waiting for history to catch up with what the camera had already quietly recorded. Within weeks of that garden ceremony, Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen, and the government that had spent over a decade obsessively curating its own image on film simply ceased to exist. What was left behind was this scattered, contradictory archive, scattered across 3 different countries. Home movies nobody looked at for decades. Evidence footage a government decided its own public wasn't ready to see. Propaganda reels seized as spoils of an entirely new war before the old one had even finished settling into the history books. And one haunting piece of newsreel that had been broadcast openly the entire time, hiding in plain sight as proof of a collapse nobody left in power wanted to admit was already happening around them. Different footage, different fates, but the same underlying truth running through every single reel of it. The people who controlled the cameras also controlled what the rest of the world was allowed to believe, right up until the exact moment they no longer had the power to control that anymore. That's really the question. This whole story leaves you with, and it's worth carrying with you after this video ends. We like to think of history as something that simply happened, and that the footage just shows us what happened, plainly and honestly, whenever we finally get around to sitting down and watching it. But every single piece of film in this story passed through the hands of someone who had a reason to keep it hidden, at least for a while, sometimes for decades. A government that decided it wanted a rebuilt ally more than it wanted a full public reckoning. An archive from a defeated enemy nation, quietly repurposed as leverage in an entirely new conflict nobody had planned for. A private home movie collection that nobody in a position of authority even considered historically urgent enough to open and actually look at. History isn't only what was filmed in the moment, it's also what somebody, years or decades later, eventually decided was safe enough, or useful enough, or simply forgotten enough, to finally let the rest of us see with our own eyes. And there's something almost unsettling about how ordinary the reasons were every single time. Nobody in the story is a cartoon villain hiding footage out of pure malice. It's a warehouse without enough staff to catalog everything that came through the door. It's a ministry trying to manage a fragile new peace without reopening wounds that hadn't finished healing. It's an occupying government protecting a strategic advantage during a rivalry that hadn't even fully started yet when the decision was first made. Ordinary bureaucratic caution, applied over and over again, is how some of the most important footage of the 20th century ended up sitting in the dark for decades. Not a single dramatic cover-up meeting in a smoke-filled room, just a long chain of small, reasonable-sounding decisions to wait, to prioritize something else, to deal with it later, made by people who mostly weren't thinking about what it would mean for someone sitting where you are right now, watching this 70 or 80 years later, hearing about it for what might be the very first time. If this is the first time you've heard the full story behind any of this footage, that alone should tell you something about how selectively these things get released into public memory, even when the footage itself has physically existed the entire time, sitting in a box, waiting. If you found this as unsettling as I did putting it together, do me a favor and hit like on this video right now. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling the stories that don't get covered anywhere else on this platform. And before you go, drop a comment and let me know which piece of footage in this video surprised you the most. The private home movies nobody looked at for decades. The documentary a government finished and then buried on purpose. The archive locked behind Soviet borders for half a century. Or Hitler's own final appearance on camera, hiding in plain sight the entire time. I read every single comment on these videos, and I genuinely want to know where you land on this one. If you haven't already, subscribe. Because there are more stories exactly like this one coming. The footage that got filmed, then buried, and is only now, decades later, finally coming back into the light.